So checking for fallacies. So when we are making an argument or responding to an argument, we always want to consider whether or not the argument is making any fallacies. So what's a fallacy? It's a form of faulty reasoning. Another way of putting it is the conclusion, what you're trying to argue for, doesn't follow from the premises. The premises are what you're trying to argue with. So you start from the premises, try to get to the conclusion. But if the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, then you have a fallacy. So let's look at some examples of fallacies. These would be examples of bad arguments, faulty reasonings. Okay, so the first argument that's a fallacy is an ad hominem. What does that mean? It means you're arguing against the person. So you're attacking someone's character rather than addressing the issue. So an example they give, Jack Turner has no business talking about the way we run things in the city. He's just another flaky liberal. Okay, so this is a fallacy. Why is it a fallacy? Well, because just because you're a flaky liberal doesn't mean you can't talk about things, you can't talk about business in the city, right? Flaky liberals can talk about that too. We don't even know if Jack Turner is or is not a flaky liberal, but it doesn't matter. Even if he is, let's say he is. If he is, he can still talk about business in the city. That it doesn't follow that flaky liberals can't talk about that. If you were going to make that case, you would have to explain why being a flaky liberal makes you unable to talk about the way we run things in the city. You have to explain that because one doesn't follow from the other. So next, bandwagon appeals. So it argues that because others think or do something, we should do it too. So that's what they call the bandwagon, right? It's also like it's an appeal to the popular thing. So what's an example? So let's say there's a breakfast cereal and it claims to be America's favorite cereal. Now, we don't know if that's true. It may be true. That cereal might be the most popular cereal in America by vote or by purchasing, right? Maybe they get purchased more than any other cereal. Does that mean that they're the best cereal? Maybe not. It may be the best cereal because people are buying it because it's the best. That could be true. But people could also be buying it because it's cheap. Maybe it's the cheapest cereal, so it's not the best cereal. It's just it's just like some cheap bad cereal, like tasteless cereal. That could be the case, right? So you can't argue from the bandwagon, from what's most popular, from what other people think to what's true or what's best. It could just be that other people are all wrong. Everybody's wrong. That could be possible, right? Next fallacy, begging the question. So begging the question is just a circular argument. So what is a circular argument? It's like saying, well, B is true because A, and A is true because B. So that's a circle, right? So they say, essentially asserting that A is true because A is true. So here's an example. Affirmative action can never be fair or just because you cannot remedy one injustice by committing another. So why is this begging the question? Well, you're saying it can't be fair or just. That's what you're saying. Why isn't it fair or just? Well, because you can't remedy one injustice by committing another. So here, notice, injustice is used here and here. So you're sort of saying, why is it not just? Well, because it's unjust. you're arguing in a circle. So whether or not affirmative action is just or unjust doesn't matter here, because even if it is just or even if it's unjust, you can't argue in a circle. That doesn't work. That doesn't get you proper reasoning. Next, we have either or. So this is also called a false dilemma or an oversimplification. So here we're basically saying you either do this or you do that. What could be a fallacy about that? Well, maybe there aren't just two possible choices. Maybe there are more than two. So let's look at an example. Those who oppose our actions in this war are enemies of freedom. Okay, so here we have either you oppose our actions in this war and are enemies of freedom, or you don't oppose our actions in this war and are friends of freedom, I guess, right? But couldn't you have a third option? So couldn't you oppose the actions in the war, but be a friend of freedom? Couldn't you do that? I mean, maybe you could be neutral in the war, be the Switzerland of the war, and just say, I'm not going to take sides. I like freedom, but I'm not taking sides. You could do that, right? So it's not true to give an either or in a manner that pushes out other options, right? We want to consider all options, not just two options. So that's why it's called a false dilemma. False analogies. So this is where you compare things, right? Compare things that resemble each other in some ways, but not in the important respects. So let's give an example. Trees pollute the air just as much as cars and trucks do. So this is interesting. So trees do give off gases, right? Trees do that. And so do cars and trucks. So you can compare trees and you can compare cars and trucks. But this really misses the point. This analogy, this comparison misses the point, because trees give off different kinds of gases than cars and trucks do. So the point is not that they both pollute. The point is, what kinds of pollution are they emitting? Are some of those bad? Are some of those good? Are some of those are some of those neutral? That gets at the question. So it's dishonest, or maybe not dishonest, but it's mistaken to frame the comparison in this way. Faulty causality. So this is when you assume that events following each other imply causality. So just because one event followed another, the first event caused the second. So we have another way of saying it: after this, therefore because of this. And we know that just because something happened after doesn't mean it happened because of. So let's look at an example. Legalizing same-sex marriage in Sweden led to a decline in the marriage rate of opposite-sex couples. Okay, so we legalize same-sex marriage, and then after we legalize same-sex marriage, opposite-sex couples stopped getting married. Are those things connected? Well, I mean, you might be able to claim that you might have some kind of idea that they are, because one happened and then the other happened, so you're connecting those dots. But what's the causality there? Why does legalizing same-sex marriage cause other marriages to stop happening? You would have to explain the causality for that to work. You can't just assume because one thing happened and then another thing happened. You can't assume causality. Another way of putting that is the famous phrase, correlation is not causation. Just because things are correlated so that they look like they're happening together does not mean they're happening because of each other. So the next fallacy here is straw man. So a straw man is when you make the opposing position more ridiculous or extreme than it really is. So by making it more ridiculous and extreme, it's easier to refute them. It's easier to counter them. But in reality, they have a more substantial position, and you're not responding to their substantial position. You're responding to this ridiculous version of their position. So here's a good example. You want the poor to starve. Okay, and the context of this is someone argues that funding for supplemental nutrition assistance should be cut. Okay, so I'm saying, let's say I say, I don't want to pay for that nutritional assistance. And then you respond, you want the poor to starve. Now, by saying that, have you accurately represented my position? No, I never said I want the poor to starve. I did not say that at all. That is making my position look really extreme and really bad. But I didn't say that at all. I just said I don't want to pay. I don't want to fund this supplemental nutrition assistance. The poor could still feed themselves without supplemental nutrition assistance, and somebody else could pay for the supplemental nutrition assistance, right? The poor don't necessarily have to starve because we've cut the funding. So that's not a good representation of a position like that. And so that's a straw man. So a straw man oftentimes is contrasted with a steel man. So the steel man would be where you make their position look good. Even though you disagree with it, you make their position look as good as it can look, and then you attack that. Because if you attack the best version of their position, then you know you've refuted it. And you've also treated them respectfully. You treated your opponent respectfully in the disagreement. Next fallacy, hasty generalization. So this is a conclusion based on insufficient, or inappropriately qualified evidence. So what's a good example of this? 20 randomly chosen residents of Brooklyn, New York were asked whether they found graffiti tags offensive. 14 said yes, and 5 said no, and 1 had no opinion. Therefore, 70% of Brooklyn residents find tagging offensive. So, what we're arguing for here, we're saying we're making a conclusion that's general. It's about all Brooklyn residents. And we're making that conclusion based on 20 randomly chosen residents. We're saying these 20 randomly chosen said this. Therefore, all of Brooklyn residents said this. Now, is that true? Well, if those randomly chosen residents were a representative sample, then it would be true. They represent the bigger group, then it's true. But when you select people, does it necessarily represent the bigger group? No, not necessarily. You could have had a biased sample. It might not have truly been random. And that might, basically the part of a thing might not correspond to the whole of the thing. So you would want to reinforce this and have reasons to think that you can scale up from the part to the whole. Because parts and wholes are not always the same. Like it's almost like a problem you could have is if you said, well, the wheels of a car are made of rubber, therefore a car is made of rubber. That would not be true, right? Obviously not, because what's true of the part is not necessarily true of the whole. You can't generalize from one part of something, generalize to the whole of the thing necessarily. In other things, maybe you can, or you can do it with a caveat. You can do it carefully, but not in every case, right? So what's our last fallacy here? A slippery slope. So a slippery slope argument asserts that one event will inevitably lead to another. This is often a cataclysmic event, and it's without preventing evidence of the chain of causes and effect that will take place. So here's an example. If the state legislature passes this 2% tax increase, it won't be long before all corporations in the state move to other states and leave thousands unemployed. Okay, so you have one event, which is the 2% tax increase, and that's going to lead down a slippery slope to thousands being unemployed. Now, is this true? Well, I mean, it could end up that way, but you have to make a case that first you have to say this 2% tax increase will definitely lead to corporations leaving the state. Now, is that true? Well, no. Some corporations may leave, others may stay. 2%, I mean, maybe they'll just absorb the cost. Some of them will, some of them might not, and then they would move and take the cost of moving. But it's not obvious that all corporations will do that. And then even if corporations leave the state, does that leave thousands unemployed? Well, it depends how many corporations leave the state. And it depends, I mean, it could also be the case that other corporations come to the state, depending. So it's not inevitably true that just because corporations leave the state, thousands will be unemployed. Those corporations leaving the state don't necessarily leave a total vacuum in the state in which no other companies will come and no other companies will employ people. So you can't assume that that's inevitable. Now you may be able to point to some cause and effect and buttress your case a little bit, but it's not an inevitable thing that one of these things leads to the other, right? Okay, so those are some common fallacies that we're going to want to look for whenever we're assessing arguments.